People always say, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned," but they are entirely wrong. The real terror is a mother who stays perfectly silent while her sick child is treated like a cheap stunt. When Julian smiled, signing that hospital check for our 10-year-old daughter in front of the flashing cameras, he thought he bought my obedience. He never realized my deadpan smile was the official death warrant for his entire empire. Hello, dear listeners of the Vivian Revenge Stories channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without a budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description or pinned comment of this video. My name is Piper Payne. The shrill beep of the ventilator was the only constant in my life until the billing department of Memorial Hospital in Chicago called. The voice on the other end was aggressively polite, using the kind of professional detachment reserved for delivering catastrophic news. They informed me that my daughter's treatment for her rare autoimmune disease would be officially suspended by Friday morning. I owed over $200,000 in overdue fees. I was a senior data analyst at Aegis Data Solutions, making a very decent living, but no earthly salary could keep up with Maya's relentless medical expenses. I sat by her hospital bed, holding her frail 10-year-old hand, calculating exactly how many hours I had left to sell everything I owned, including my own blood, just to buy her one more week of breath. Then, the heavy wooden door of the private ward swung open. It was Julian Vance, my ex-husband, the biopharma billionaire who had walked out on us 3 years ago when the reality of raising a sick child became too inconvenient for his pristine lifestyle. He strolled into the sterile, bleach-scented room, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than a solid month of Maya's intensive care. He did not look at our daughter first. He looked straight at the hospital administrator trailing nervously behind him. "Put it all on my black card," Julian said, his voice smooth, carrying just enough artificial warmth for the nurses outside the door to swoon. "Every overdue fee, paid in full right now, and upgrade them to the VIP suite." When the room finally cleared of gawking staff, he turned to me. "Piper, this is ridiculous. You are drowning. Move back into the penthouse. Let us be a family again, just to care for her properly." I looked at the man who had traded our family for corporate stock options and a younger model. I knew the hospital board was watching. I knew the local press would find out within the hour. He desperately needed the public relations boost for his company's upcoming launch. He needed to look like the savior. I needed my daughter alive. "Okay," I said. My voice carried absolutely no anger, no immense gratitude, and no trace of emotion. Just a hollow, deadpan agreement. Moving into Julian's massive glass-walled penthouse felt like stepping into a beautifully curated tomb. It was not just Julian waiting for us, but his new fiancée, Serena. Serena was a high-society social media star whose entire existence revolved around her glowing ring lights and a completely non-existent charity foundation she used to evade taxes. Within 48 hours of our arrival, my sick, exhausted child became her absolute favorite prop. "Oh, my brave little warrior," Serena cooed one afternoon, pressing her perfectly manicured cheek against Maya's pale, sweaty forehead. The camera flash blinded me from across the room, but I did not blink. "We are raising $10 million for children just like her. Link in bio, guys. Smash that donate button." I stood in the corner, folding laundry, perfectly quiet. I watched Maya. My daughter was only 10 years old, but her soul was ancient from enduring endless pain. Maya used to reach out for Julian, her little voice begging him to read her a bedtime story or just hold her hand. But children are devastatingly observant. It took Maya exactly 1 week to stop asking for her father's love. She realized, with a heartbreaking maturity, that he only ever picked her up, only ever kissed her hollowed cheeks, when Serena's camera lenses were focused on them. The second the recording stopped, Julian would immediately sanitize his hands and retreat to his soundproof home office. Julian fully expected a fight from me. He expected the bitter, exhausted ex-wife who used to scream at him for working 80-hour weeks while our daughter burned with a fever of 104 degrees. He wanted me to throw a massive fit about Serena exploiting Maya so he could call me unstable, kick me out, and play the victim for the media. I completely denied him that pleasure. I became the invisible ghost of the penthouse. "Piper, I am having the private caterers use the main kitchen for my gala prep, so you will need to feed Maya in her room tonight," Serena would say, tossing her expensive hair. "Of course, Serena," I replied, keeping my eyes submissively fixed on the marble floor. "Whatever you need." "You are awful quiet these days, Piper," Julian remarked one late evening, sipping his 50-year-old scotch, his eyes narrowing as he probed for a weakness. "I am just terribly tired, Julian. Thank you for letting us stay," I murmured, serving him his drink before fading back into the deep shadows of the hallway. He smirked, taking a slow sip. He genuinely thought I was broken. He thought the crushing weight of poverty and despair had finally brought me to my knees. He was a billionaire used to buying compliance, and he naturally assumed my utter silence was pure submission. He was dead wrong. My absolute, unflinching obedience was the most perfect camouflage I could ever invent. While Julian slept, and while Serena obsessed over her rising follower count, I sat in the pitch black of Maya's room with my laptop glowing softly. As a senior data analyst at Aegis Data Solutions, I saw the entire world in raw numbers, hidden patterns, and structural vulnerabilities. Julian's smart mansion was supposedly secured with military-grade encryption, but he was fatally arrogant. He assumed a cyber threat would come from corporate espionage, not from the defeated woman quietly heating up soup in his kitchen. It took me exactly 3 days to silently slip past the primary firewall of the estate's internal Wi-Fi network. I did not trigger a single security alarm. I simply created a backdoor, a tiny, invisible digital thread connecting my heavily encrypted laptop directly to his private home servers. I began pulling terabytes of data. I was not looking for his pathetic love letters to Serena. I was tracking his highly abnormal cash flows, the offshore shell companies, the hidden banking ledgers. I sat there in the dark, watching the digital heartbeat of his corrupt empire pulse across my screen, while my daughter's weakened heart struggled to beat right next to me. I was not a victim anymore. I was a lethal parasite in his system, and I was going to bleed him entirely dry. Living in the Vance penthouse was an exercise in surreal, agonizing contrasts. On a brisk Tuesday morning, Julian arranged for a massive, ribbon-wrapped transport trailer to be parked in the circular driveway of the estate. He had purchased a purebred Andalusian stallion for $250,000 as a grand recovery present for Maya. My daughter, whose muscle density was deteriorating so rapidly she could barely lift a spoon to feed herself, was wheeled out to the freezing balcony to look at a majestic animal she would absolutely never have the strength to ride. Julian made sure Serena's camera crew captured the exact moment he handed the heavy leather lead rope to the stable master. "Only the absolute best for my little girl," Julian announced to the glowing ring lights, his voice dripping with manufactured devotion. Yet, when I cornered him later in the kitchen, far away from the camera lenses, to ask about Vanguard Bioscience's upcoming clinical trials, his artificial warmth instantly evaporated. His pharmaceutical company was developing experimental therapies for complex autoimmune disorders. Maya was a perfect candidate. "Absolutely not," Julian snapped, aggressively adjusting his silk tie. "Having my own daughter in the trial is a massive conflict of interest, Piper. The federal regulators would scrutinize every single data point. It would jeopardize the entire $80 million research grant. I am not risking the company for a long shot. Just let the current doctors do their jobs." He was perfectly willing to buy her a $250,000 horse to stare at from a window, but he would not lift a single manicured finger to actually save her life. The hypocrisy only deepened with Serena. The millions of dollars she raised off Maya's pale, exhausted face never made it to the pediatric wards. Through the digital back door I had established earlier, I silently tracked the incoming donations. Serena had legally, though entirely unethically, redirected the funds through a dizzying maze of shell nonprofits. The money meant for dying children was currently financing the construction of an exclusive, ultra-luxury wellness retreat in Aspen. It featured crystal healing saunas, organic caviar facials, and private meditation pavilions. It was designed exclusively for her wealthy influencer friends to go detox after Fashion Week. She was building a lavish playground for the rich, using the pity harvested directly from my dying child. Their grotesque theater peaked during Maya's mandatory checkup at Memorial Hospital 2 weeks later. Julian had insisted on coming, solely because the hospital board of directors was holding an elite luncheon that afternoon. I stood quietly in the sterile corridor, watching him shake hands with the chief of medicine and the wealthy board members. He played the tragic, wealthy benefactor flawlessly, promising massive future endowments and speaking passionately about the raw agony of watching a child suffer. "She is my entire world," Julian told the board chairman, placing a hand firmly over his heart. Not 5 minutes later, as the board dispersed, Julian walked down the hallway toward the exit. He passed directly by Maya's open door. Inside, Maya began coughing weakly, and her pulse oximeter suddenly flared. A harsh red light flashed wildly across the dark room as the alarm screeched its urgent warning. Her oxygen was dropping. The nurses were still down the hall. I was rushing back from the pharmacy desk. Julian paused. He looked straight into the room. He saw his daughter gasping, the red light casting terrifying shadows across her small face. He checked his gold watch, pulled out his phone, and simply kept walking. He had a lunch reservation to make. I reached the room seconds later, calming Maya, adjusting her mask until her oxygen levels slowly stabilized. I stroked her damp hair, staring at the empty doorway where her father had just stood. That was the exact moment any lingering trace of humanity I held for him permanently vanished. Julian, however, was not entirely stupid. My absolute lack of pushback, my quiet servitude, was starting to make him intensely paranoid. He fully expected me to scream about the clinical trials or the hospital incident, but I remained an absolute ghost, serving coffee and nodding politely. He needed to test the waters. One evening, I walked into his private study to deliver his dry cleaning. Julian was conveniently absent. On his massive mahogany desk sat his primary work laptop. It was wide open, completely unlocked, with his private corporate email inbox glowing invitingly on the screen. It was the most obvious, pathetic trap I had ever seen in my life. He wanted to see if I was snooping. He undoubtedly had keystroke loggers installed and hidden webcams recording the entire room. I did not even break my stride. I placed the dry cleaning on the leather armchair, completely ignored the glowing screen, and quietly closed the door behind me. I did not need his heavily monitored personal laptop. I was already miles past his desktop folders. Back in the safety of the dark laundry room, I opened my own encrypted device. Using the complex predictive algorithms I designed at Aegis Data Solutions, I bypassed his personal hardware entirely and targeted Vanguard Bioscience's external satellite servers. I was searching for the anomalies, the tiny mathematical discrepancies in their massive research budgets. My code sifted through billions of bytes of corporate data, ignoring the main financial ledgers and hunting for the shadows. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the algorithm finally struck gold. It pulled up a deeply buried, heavily encrypted network of files hidden under a dummy corporate tax identifier. It was a ghost ledger, a completely parallel accounting system designed to hide something massive from the company's own shareholders and federal regulators. I leaned in, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my cold eyes, ready to rip his darkest secrets wide open. The Ghost Ledger was a digital labyrinth of fake shell companies and encrypted transactions, but I was not navigating it alone. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, a secure, self-destructing message bypassed my own firewall and popped onto my monitor. The sender was entirely anonymous, hiding behind 7 layers of international proxy servers, but the digital signature pointed straight back to the internal secure networks of Vanguard Bioscience. It was a whistleblower. Someone deep inside Julian's corporate fortress who could no longer stomach the grotesque rot of his leadership. The message contained absolutely zero text. It was only an alphanumeric string, a heavily encrypted decryption key pointing directly to the deepest research and development archives Vanguard possessed. I spent the next 8 hours locked in the suffocating silence of the laundry room, the only sound the faint hum of the central heating system. I had Maya's complete medical history open on my left monitor. The files documented every agonizing drop in her white blood cell count, every invasive bone marrow biopsy she endured, and every single night she cried because her joints felt like they were packed with crushed glass. On my right monitor, I began unlocking the classified research and development files using the whistleblower's key. As a senior data analyst, my brain is fundamentally wired to find matching patterns in a sea of chaos. I started running Maya's highly specific genetic markers and protein deficiencies against Vanguard's experimental compound database. The digital progress bar crawled across the screen. 10%, 45%, 89%. Then, a perfect 100% match flashed in bright neon green. I opened the primary project file. It was designated as Compound V73. I systematically read the executive summary, then the clinical trial results, and finally the definitive synthesis reports. My breath caught sharply in my throat, not from overwhelming sadness, but from a paralyzing, suffocating shock. The exact cure for Maya's rare autoimmune disease, a permanent cellular reversal therapy, had been fully and successfully synthesized. It was not a theory. It was not stuck in the preliminary testing phase. It was completely finished, packaged, and stable. But the date stamped on the final approval document made the blood literally freeze in my veins. The drug had been completed exactly 12 months ago. For an entire year, while I sold off my life insurance policy, while I begged the hospital billing department for extra time, and while Maya withered away into a shadow of a child in a sterile bed, the absolute cure was sitting in a climate-controlled vault less than 10 miles away. I dug fiercely into the archived executive emails. Julian had orchestrated a massive calculated delay. He fabricated a synthetic shortage of the primary base chemicals needed to produce the drug, artificially halting all public progress. Why would a pharmaceutical company hide a miracle cure? Because Vanguard Bioscience was preparing for an initial public offering on the stock market in exactly 3 weeks. Julian was intentionally suppressing the market. If he released the cure last year, the company's valuation would have steadily, but slowly, climbed. But if he held it back, allowed a desperate global crisis to build for this specific group of diseases, and then miraculously unveiled the cure on the exact day his company went public, the stock price would explode overnight. He was turning a life-saving medical breakthrough into a $5 billion personal launchpad. But Maya was the fatal flaw in his perfect timeline. If Julian allowed his own dying daughter to receive Compound Phi 73, federal law would immediately intervene. The Food and Drug Administration mandates strict, immediate reporting for compassionate use exemptions. If Maya was suddenly cured, the federal regulators would require Vanguard to disclose the drug's efficacy to the public market right then and there. The secret would be out prematurely. The meticulously planned stock manipulation scheme would completely collapse. To protect his upcoming billion-dollar payday, Julian needed his 10-year-old daughter to stay sick. I kept digging, fueled by a cold, mechanical rage, and found the banking transfers. They were disguised as anonymous charitable donations, routing straight into the private offshore accounts of Memorial Hospital's senior board of directors. I opened an intercepted email from Julian to the hospital's chief of medicine. Keep the maintenance protocol strict. No experimental variables until the fourth quarter. We manage the symptoms. We do not cure the disease, the email read. He was explicitly bribing the hospital to keep Maya on an agonizing maintenance treatment. It was a regimen designed merely to keep her breathing, but never healing. He was paying them millions of dollars to stretch out her physical suffering until the stock market bell finally rang. I slowly closed the laptop. The sun was just starting to rise over the Chicago skyline, casting a pale, cold light across the marble floors of the penthouse. Most mothers would have broken down right then and there. They would have screamed until their lungs bled, shattered the expensive mirrors in the hallway, or marched directly into the master bedroom with a heavy kitchen knife. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response reserved for the helpless, and I was no longer a helpless woman drowning in medical debt. Julian had deliberately used our daughter's fading heartbeat as a stepping stone to build his billionaire empire. He looked at her frail body and saw nothing but a liability to his profit margins. I decided, with perfect icy clarity, that Julian Vance was not just going to lose his immense wealth. He was going to lose his freedom, his pristine reputation, and his mind. I was going to ensure that he would rot in a federal concrete cell for the rest of his miserable, pathetic life. The mother he thought he had crushed was dead. The architect of his absolute ruin had just woken up. Julian was growing increasingly restless. My unwavering, absolute silence was a psychological mirror he did not want to look into. He thrived on conflict, on breaking people down and watching them beg. Because I refused to give him that satisfaction, he decided to escalate his cruelty. On a dreary Monday afternoon, Julian brought Serena directly into Maya's VIP recovery suite at the hospital. This was not a visit born out of fatherly concern. It was a calculated provocation. He wanted to push me until I shattered. Serena strutted into the room wearing a heavily perfumed designer coat that immediately overpowered the sterile scent of the medical equipment. She ignored the steady, rhythmic hiss of the advanced life support machines keeping our daughter stable. "Piper, be a dear and make us some espresso," Serena commanded, waving a dismissive diamond-ringed hand toward the suite's private kitchenette. "We have been dealing with the gala planners all morning, and I am absolutely exhausted." Julian leaned against the doorframe, watching me intensely, waiting for the inevitable explosion. He wanted me to scream at his fiancée for treating me like a maid in my dying daughter's room. Instead, I gave them a soft, vacant nod. "Right away, Serena. Extra foam. Just how you like it," I murmured, turning my back to them. As I prepared the espresso machine, my eyes locked onto Julian's custom, solid black smartphone resting on the marble counter. He had placed it there to take off his coat. He was so incredibly arrogant that he left it unlocked. But I did not need to guess his passcode or swipe through his messages. With a swift, practiced motion, I slipped a microscopic data cloning chip out of my pocket. I had procured it through an old contact at Aegis Data Solutions. The chip was no larger than a grain of sand. In one seamless movement, I pressed it firmly into the charging port of his device. It snapped into place, completely invisible. I poured the espresso, arranged the cups on a silver tray, and carried it back to them with perfectly steady hands. The trap was set. Serena took a sip, her eyes drifting toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. "Julian, darling," Serena whined, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the monitors. "This view is absolutely spectacular. It is completely wasted on someone who is asleep all day. You know, Chloe is coming in for her rhinoplasty revision next week. She desperately needs a room with good natural light for her recovery vlogs. Cannot we just move Maya down to the general pediatric ward? She does not need all this massive space." Julian glanced at Maya, whose chest rose and fell in shallow, labored movements. Then he looked at me, a cruel, testing glint in his eye. He was waiting for the mother bear to finally attack. "You make a valid point, Serena," Julian said smoothly. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and flagged down the attending nurse in the hallway. "Transfer my daughter to the standard ward immediately. My fiancé has a VIP client requiring this suite." The nurse looked horrified. "Mr. Vance, the standard wards do not have the integrated high-dependency life support networks your daughter currently relies on. The transition could be extremely detrimental to her respiratory stability." "She will manage," Julian replied coldly, signing the transfer order with a flourish. "Do it." He looked at me, waiting for the tears, the screaming, the desperate pleading. I simply picked up their empty espresso cups, washed them in the sink, and began packing Maya's small bag. I did not utter a single syllable of protest. They wheeled Maya down to a cramped, dimly lit room on the 4th floor. The standard respiratory machine they hooked her up to was loud, clunky, and far less efficient. As soon as the hospital staff left us alone, I did not waste time crying over the downgrade. I opened my laptop. The rage inside me was a hyper-focused, freezing laser. By forcing the transfer, Julian thought he had won the psychological war. He did not realize he had just given me the perfect excuse to completely bypass the hospital's internal logistics firewall. Operating from the dark corner of the cramped room, I hacked directly into the hospital's central inventory management system. I created a phantom profile, a completely fake patient ID registered to Maya's exact room number. Using my administrative override codes, I routed the highest-grade life support equipment, the automated oxygen compressors, and the advanced biometrics monitors directly to our new room under the ghost patient's name. Within 2 hours, an orderly unknowingly delivered the exact machines Maya needed, assuming it was a critical emergency order. I quietly connected the advanced systems to my daughter, securing her fragile life while remaining entirely off the official hospital ledger. With Maya breathing easily again, I turned my attention to the real weapon. The microchip I had planted in Julian's phone was actively transmitting a continuous stream of data to my encrypted server. I sat in the pale glow of the screen, assembling the final arsenal. I downloaded the high-definition audio recordings captured by his phone's compromised microphone. I listened to him laughing with his broker about artificial stock inflation. I documented the offshore wire transfers used to bribe the hospital board. I compiled the internal Vanguard Bioscience emails, proving he had the cure locked away. I meticulously organized every single digital fingerprint, every audio file, and every financial transaction into a massive, uncrackable digital vault. It was a perfectly designed, completely undeletable archive of his absolute destruction. I was no longer just the grieving mother playing the victim. I was the executioner, and my blade was finally perfectly sharpened. The grand ballroom of the Millennium Tower in downtown Chicago was transformed into a dazzling, suffocating monument to corporate greed. The room was dripping in imported orchids and crystal, buzzing with the electric energy of Wall Street tycoons and pharmaceutical executives. Tonight was the official celebration of Vanguard Bioscience's initial public offering. The market had responded to the artificial shortage with absolute frenzy. The stock opened at exactly $150 a share at 9 o'clock in the morning. By the ringing of the closing bell, it had surged a staggering 350%. Julian Vance was no longer just wealthy. He had officially crossed the threshold into the realm of untouchable multi-billionaires. I stood alone in the dark shadows of the second-floor mezzanine, looking down at the sea of designer tuxedos and million-dollar diamond necklaces. I wore a tailored, floor-length black gown. It was sharp, severe, and completely devoid of warmth. I looked exactly like an executioner arriving to deliver a long overdue verdict. I was, of course, entirely uninvited. The heavy perimeter of armed private security guards stationed at the velvet ropes downstairs had not stopped me. 30 minutes earlier, sitting in the back of a taxi, I had utilized my Aegis data access to silently infiltrate the hotel's mainframe. I injected my credentials directly into the encrypted digital VIP manifest, assigning myself the highest tier of security clearance. When I approached the entrance, the guards practically bowed, completely oblivious to the digital ghost walking past their metal detectors. Down on the main stage, the lights dimmed to a soft, reverent blue. Julian stepped up to the crystal podium. He looked perfectly tailored, exuding the magnetic charm of a visionary leader. Behind him, a massive 70-foot digital display screen flickered to life. It began playing a highly produced, emotionally manipulative montage of sick children in hospital beds. Suddenly, a massive high-definition photograph of Maya's pale, exhausted face filled the entire room. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached, but my hands remained perfectly steady. "We are not merely building a profitable company," Julian spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing with practiced, theatrical sorrow. He gripped the edges of the podium and expertly let a single tear catch the bright stage lights. "We are fighting a war for the future. I know the absolute agony of watching your own child slip away in the dark. I know the feeling of profound helplessness. That is precisely why tonight, Vanguard Bioscience is officially pledging $10 million to fund aggressive global research. We will not stop until we finally discover a cure for these innocent children." The ballroom erupted into thunderous standing applause. Billionaires wiped away sympathetic tears with silk handkerchiefs. It was the most sickening, grotesque performance I had ever witnessed. He was standing on a mountain of gold, promising to search for a cure that was currently locked in his own underground vault. While the crowd cheered for their fake savior, I turned away from the balcony railing and moved silently down the restricted, carpeted hallway toward the central audiovisual control room. The heavy oak door was secured by a biometric lock. I bypassed it in less than 40 seconds, using a copied digital frequency from the hotel manager's tablet. Inside the dark room, a lone technician was hunched over the massive mixing board, completely absorbed in the stage feed through his noise-canceling headphones. He did not even turn around when I slipped in. I did not need to confront him. I crouched in the shadows behind the main server rack and connected my heavily encrypted laptop directly to the hotel's master network hub. It was time to cage the animals. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a highly complex lockdown protocol I had meticulously coded the night before. I bypassed the standard fire safety relays and took complete, absolute control of the building's physical security grid. I isolated the heavy, steel-reinforced double doors surrounding the main ballroom. With one final keystroke, I engaged the primary magnetic locks and intentionally scrambled the emergency override frequencies. A synchronized, heavy mechanical click echoed faintly through the walls. Every single exit was permanently sealed shut. No panicking investors could run out to sell their shares. No damage control public relations managers could escape into the lobby to make frantic phone calls. The trap was perfectly, irrevocably closed. Down below, the applause finally began to die down. Julian raised a crystal flute of vintage champagne, flashing that signature deadpan smile he used the day he signed Maya's hospital check. "To the future of medicine," Julian declared brightly. The crowd raised their glasses in unison. I hit the enter key. The triumphant orchestral music abruptly cut out, replaced instantly by a deafening, high-pitched electronic screech that made hundreds of executives violently cover their ears and drop their crystal glasses. The massive 70-foot screen behind Julian went pitch black. The warm, flattering stage lights shifted instantly to a harsh, blinding interrogation room, white. Julian spun around, his perfect smile faltering into a look of sheer, unadulterated panic as his carefully curated promotional video vanished. The massive screen flickered wildly for 3 seconds. Then, in brilliant, glaring red text that illuminated the terrified faces of every billionaire in the room. The ghost ledger went live. The massive 70-foot screen above the stage did not just display documents, it projected an absolute slaughter. First came the official FDA submission drafts for Compound Fee 73, complete with the final efficacy reports and the irrefutable completion date stamped clearly in bold red letters, 12 months prior. Then, the screen violently transitioned to the private banking ledgers. The crowd gasped as the offshore wire transfers flashed before their eyes, detailing the exact multi-million-dollar bribes Julian had authorized to the board of directors at Memorial Hospital. The memo lines, decoded from his personal emails, read, "Maintenance protocol funding." He was paying them to keep children in agonizing pain. I stepped out of the shadows of the mezzanine and walked calmly down the grand, sweeping staircase. The heavy silence in the room was deafening. Every camera, every eye, and every blinding spotlight shifted from the horrifying truth on the screen directly to me. My black gown swept silently across the marble floor as I approached the stage. The private security guards, realizing their communication radios were entirely jammed, stood frozen in pure confusion. Julian was hyperventilating. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and the golden tan seemed to drain completely from his face. As I stepped onto the podium, he lunged forward to grab my arm, his eyes wide with a feral, cornered panic. I swatted his hand away with a look of such absolute disgust that he physically recoiled. I reached out and took the crystal microphone from his trembling fingers. "My name is Piper Payne," I said, my voice echoing like thunder across the locked, cavernous ballroom. "And this man, the visionary you are all applauding tonight, successfully synthesized the absolute cure for my daughter's terminal illness exactly 1 year ago. He locked that cure inside a temperature-controlled vault. He intentionally fabricated a global shortage. He let his own 10-year-old daughter suffocate in a hospital bed, enduring relentless, agonizing pain, simply to artificially inflate the stock price of Vanguard Bioscience before this public offering. He traded my child's heartbeat for your profit margins." The ballroom erupted into sheer pandemonium. Flashbulbs exploded like a lightning storm. The wealthy investors who had just toasted to his brilliance were now frantically pulling out their phones, screaming at their brokers to dump the stock before the market officially registered the catastrophe. "It was not me!" Julian screamed over the noise, his voice cracking hysterically. He pointed a shaking finger wildly toward the VIP tables where his executives sat. "It was the board of directors. They forced the delay. They managed the clinical trial timeline. I had no control over the hospital protocols." I did not even blink. I reached into the pocket of my gown, pulled out my encrypted mobile device, and pressed a single button. The massive speakers surrounding the ballroom crackled to life. The high-definition audio recording I had ripped directly from the microchip planted in his phone began to play at maximum volume. Julian's own voice, captured just 48 hours ago while he was pacing in his luxurious home office, echoed over the horrified crowd. "Of course we hold the drug back," Julian's recorded voice laughed, cold and ruthlessly pragmatic. "The kids can wait a few more months on ventilators, but the stock market cannot. We launch when the panic is highest. If my own kid has to tough it out in the intensive care unit to secure a $5 billion valuation, so be it. She will survive." That was the death blow. The audio was so clear, so unimaginably cruel, that several people in the front row literally covered their mouths in horror. Julian stumbled backward, knocking over the crystal podium. It shattered into 1,000 pieces across the stage. Realizing his entire life was instantly over, he turned and sprinted toward the main emergency exits. The panicked crowd followed him, a stampede of the absolute elite, clawing at the heavy brass handles. But my lockdown protocol was flawless. The heavy steel doors remained magnetically sealed shut. They were trapped inside a gilded cage of their own making. Suddenly, The sharp, authoritative sound of heavy breaching rams echoed from the lobby. The heavy oak doors violently burst open, the magnetic locks shattering under the immense, calculated force of a coordinated raid. Dozens of heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, flooded into the ballroom. I had sent them the entire decrypted ghost ledger 12 hours before the gala even started. Serena, seeing the federal windbreakers closing in on her fiancé, instantly realized her luxury empire was crumbling. Without a second thought, she ripped the 10-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it aggressively at Julian's chest. "You absolute monster!" Serena shrieked loudly, ensuring her personal live stream camera, which she had been holding this entire time, caught her perfect angle of betrayal. "I had no idea. I am completely innocent. You used me. You used that poor, sick little girl." Federal agents slammed Julian against the nearest marble pillar. They violently yanked his arms behind his back, the sharp click of heavy steel handcuffs cutting through the chaotic screaming of the crowd. He looked back at me, his eyes wide, pleading, silently begging for the merciful, quiet wife he thought he had broken. I just stared back at him with the same deadpan, emotionless smile I wore the day he paid Maya's hospital bill. Julian Vance was formally indicted on 84 federal counts of massive securities fraud, severe medical malpractice, gross criminal negligence, and massive corporate extortion. The judge denied him bail entirely. Vanguard Bioscience collapsed instantly, its stock price plummeting to absolutely zero before the sun even rose. All of his assets, his private jets, the glass penthouse, and the imported horses were immediately seized and aggressively liquidated by the federal government. With Julian rotting in a maximum security federal detention center, facing a guaranteed sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, the courts granted me emergency, full administrative control over his medical patents. Within exactly 24 hours, Maya was transferred back to the finest pediatric facility in the state. She received the very first legal dose of compound V73. It took exactly 6 months for the cellular therapy to completely eradicate the disease from her fragile body. On a warm, beautiful Tuesday morning, the hospital doors slid open for the very last time. Maya walked out entirely on her own. She did not need a wheelchair. She did not need an oxygen mask. Her cheeks were flushed with vibrant, healthy color, and her bright eyes sparkled with a life Julian had desperately tried to steal. I held her small, strong hand tightly in mine. We stepped out together into the brilliant, blinding sunshine, leaving the dark, rotting ashes of Julian's dead empire forever behind us. Thank you so very much for listening to today's story. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? Please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the secure PayPal link located in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our hardworking team, helping them feed their families while we continue creating more incredible stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.